Ready for me? Okay, great. Well, good evening. I am just really happy to be here with old friends and friends I haven't met before. And I also feel like the Sangha is an old friend. I haven't taught here for a while, but I've really enjoyed it. And the topic I chose for tonight is practical equanimity. So, just by a quick show of hands, how many people have either practiced with or are familiar with the terms upekkha in the Pali language or equanimity in the Buddhist context? Okay, so at least half. And just one or two people, what does equanimity or upekkha call to mind? And feel free to unmute yourself and then just remute yourself when you're done.
For me, it's just like a calm or peaceful mind.
Okay, thanks, Philip. Anyone else?
Yeah. To me, it means accepting what is peacefully. And I was going to say with equanimity.
All right. You know what? In Buddhist contexts and other contexts, it's perfectly okay to define things circularly. In
Oh,
fact,
good.
we
Okay.
often do. So great, and that's just a good start. And so I called, and we will include that and take off from there. So I called the talk "Practical Equanimity" because I was interested in looking beyond the idea that equanimity is so lofty that we'll never reach it, or that it's something cold and impersonal and undesirable. So, as a starting point, equanimity or upekkha is the pinnacle, the absolute pinnacle of three different Buddhist lists. It is the end point of the 10 paramis, which are perfections of heart and mind that in Buddhist legend, the Buddha to be, then called the Bodhisattva, practiced in previous lives. And the point isn't whether any one of us does or doesn't believe in the cosmology of rebirth, more the sense of the importance that the tradition places on these practical everyday qualities that we cultivate in our everyday lives. Equanimity is also the pinnacle of the 7 factors of awakening and of the 4 Brahma Viharas, or divine abodes, which are these qualities of heart, along with metta, which is loving kindness, karuna, which is compassion, and mudita, which is appreciative joy. So, what is this supreme quality? Sometimes it's described as a mind state or a feeling, and I heard some of that in the room. A state of mind, non-reactivity, composure, even-mindedness, the ability to remain calm and undisturbed, impartiality, absence of preferences. Does anyone here happen to have absence of preferences? Yeah, well, I don't either. I don't either. And for many of us, this can seem impossible. There is a different approach, not an incompatible approach, but another one. And Ajahn Sucitto, who is a contemporary British monk in the Thai tradition, wonderful teacher, and he has written a book called Parami, which I highly recommend, about the paramis or perfections. And he says, as a perfection, equanimity is an intention or mental muscle rather than a feeling. So an intention or a mental muscle is more of a process or a practice. And I'll read a little bit from his book. He says the mind always finds something to get irritated about or fascinated by. It always finds something to need, worry about, and sorrow over, which is natural enough. But then an undeveloped mind adds craving, aversion, and self-interest on top of that. So the fact that we have these preferences and reactions is not a big deal. I mean, in fact, we do, so it better not be a big deal. But what do we add on? Our heart capacity and vision shrink. We lose touch with the good fortune we have and how much worse it could be. We forget and lose empathy for the misfortune of others. And we edit out, we try to not see all the ugly, smelly, rough, and tedious aspects of our lives. So full stop, our lives, including our mental and emotional lives, have ugly, smelly, rough, and tedious. He goes on to say the only way out is through a different approach, developing equanimity as self-acceptance. He says, I like to define this process as having 3 stages: pay attention, meet what arises, and include it all. That is, feel the thoughts, feelings, and emotions as they are. Widen the focus to feel how they're affecting the body, and let empathetic attention rest over the whole of it. Don't get busy, and don't just wait for things to end. That isn't a full inclusion. Instead, soften those attitudes and include it all. And let that process continue for whatever arises next. There will be a release, which might not be what you were expecting. So if there is a release, don't assume you know what it looks like. So this is a quite different approach. And it's not either or, it's both and. Equanimity is both the sublime state we aspire to and the intention or practice. But I think this different approach, as a practice, as an intention, as an engagement, the way Suchito frames it, he does not mean that in practicing equanimity we'll feel a particular way. We may not feel any particular way. It's about how we engage with what we're really experiencing. And it's about, as some of you said at the beginning, it's about engaging with the full range of our feelings, including reactivity and including caring. And to me, this seems particularly important for the times we're in now, obviously also for all other times. But you know, we are a year and a half into a pandemic. You know, newsflash, we are still in a pandemic. It has had its ups and downs. There has been optimism, there has been pessimism. We're in a pandemic. Some of us may have been very ill. Some of us may have lost loved ones. Some of us may have had a relatively secluded and more privileged way of weathering it, but we still have been surrounded by collective trauma and by the need to do everything we needed to do to stay safe. We've been through several years of unprecedented, at least in many of our lifetimes, political and social upheaval. And you know, the climate is burning at the edge of our vision, especially where some of us live. There's real concern. We can smell it in the air. So how do we work with this in our training as a process or a practice? How do we learn to engage exactly when things aren't on an even keel? Because they often aren't. So as a starting reminder, insight meditation or Vipassana, the tradition that this Sangha mostly practices in, is about seeing. It's about cultivating awareness of how the mind-body system operates. And the way it's often described, you may have heard it in many Dharma talks, that we learn to see how the mind takes us into and out of suffering. And that the trajectory of that seeing is that the more we see it, the more we move away from that, the more we cease to do that. And there's nothing wrong with that as a description. I think it can be a little bit abstract. And so I actually prefer a more qualitative description, that it's more of a being with. I've heard teachers, again in the Thai forest tradition, talk about standing under, as if we're standing under a waterfall and feeling it all, feeling it come down over our heads. So really, experientially, a patient experiencing that over time allows some unraveling of knots. And just to give a feel for how basic this is, and in some ways how simple, Majjhima Nikaya 10, which is from the middle-length discourses of the Buddha, is the Satipatthana Sutta. Sutta is one of the ancient Buddhist teaching stories, and Satipatthana is the foundation of mindfulness. So it's in some ways considered a central teaching story for this tradition of Buddhist practice. And one of the central lines in that teaching is a bhikkhu, a monk, but we would also say any practitioner. A bhikkhu abides contemplating the body as a body. Now, what does that mean? It's not top down. It's simply the body feeling the body. And I know that when I was first practicing, I would hear teachers say things like, bring your awareness into your feet or your hands or your body or your this or your that. And I, maybe because I tended to live in my head a lot, I always had the feeling that, the awareness was up here and somehow I'm supposed to bring it down to what I'm feeling. But no, it's feel the body as the body, feel the body with the body. Do the feet feel what the feet feel? The feet feel the feet. Right now, allow the feeling in your feet. You're feeling that in your feet. So it's just a very not top down, very simply, again and again and again, feeling what we're feeling. So let's talk about some practical approaches to begin working in this vein. And I'm going to offer a handful of approaches, and then I'm going to invite your thoughts. Many of the things I'm going to mention may be things we're doing already and have maybe done for a long time, but we haven't necessarily named them as equanimity practice. But all of these speak to how we hold turbulence and reactivity in a larger container, how we see them through a wider lens. And that is the cultivation of equanimity. Because it's not that we're going to stop encountering upset or turbulence, but that over time we're learning to do something different with it. We're holding it differently. And just to be clear, when I list some practices, I'm not offering a list of ways to get calm, though of course it's wonderful when we are calm. But calm may be a natural outgrowth, but again, we're being present with whatever we feel, and calm is only one emotion. It's one of the many. And as we talk about these, you may find that one or two of these practices resonate. And if so, you might want to adopt these, play with them, make them your own. But don't overdo it. Don't take on 10 new practices. I'm not even mentioning 10. Don't take on 8 new practices. More is definitely not better. So as a starting point, sitting meditation is still the bedrock. As I think we've already discussed, in this tradition, sitting meditation is about being with all experience in a sustained way. Again, contemplating the body as the body, contemplating mental events, emotions as mental events and emotions, contemplating feelings as feelings. So you've all meditated tonight actually. Just taking a moment right now to tune back into the body and notice your sitting posture And in this tradition, unlike some, we don't have a doctrine that you have to sit in a particular form in a particular way, but we encourage sitting in a position that's dignified, alert, relaxed. So we're not going to meditate right now. I mean, we're not going to close our eyes and meditate, but just to feel the posture for a moment or two. Is it possible without a lot of effort, maybe making minor adjustments, to settle into a posture that's alert, dignified, and relaxed? Maybe there's a little curve in the lower back. Maybe you're feeling, as you let yourself feel this from the inside, not based on what a form should look like, but from the inside of your own experience. Maybe you might feel a lift of the spine. You might tuck your chin just a little bit, just enough to open out the back of the head. You might experience the spine or the inner core as spanning the whole span between heaven and earth. And just, can you sense the peace and the energy of this from the inside? So along with sitting meditation, embodied practices such as Qigong, Tai Chi, yoga, and I'm mentioning them again, and this is deliberately a repeated theme. It's not just that they can be calming, although they can be, and that can be wonderful too. But these are all approaches to being fully aware of experience as it unfolds. Practicing in a deliberate way with the body at the same time that our emotional experience and reactions are unfolding, sometimes calm, sometimes joyful, sometimes frenzied, but practicing with the body nonetheless in a deliberate, attentive way. Through all of that, I think, is in and of itself a small form of equanimity. That reaction may be present, but it's not dictating our actions in that moment. It's not taking away from the dignity of our engagement. And I have experienced that recently in Qigong practice as a real delight. The next is just a small phrase. Ajahn Sumedho, another contemporary monk in the Thai tradition, has the phrase, "It's like this." That really refers to what's sometimes called the quality of suchness, just things in their exactitude, things as they really are. And I've heard many teachers whom he taught repeat his phrase with a hand gesture. You can't entirely see it because I'm on a small screen, but it's like this. And that's a practice for all kinds of circumstances, but in a very palpable and small but appreciable way. It's really possible at times when we're in distress, when we feel stuck, when we only see a small aspect of our experience, just the plugging into, the telling ourselves the truth, that right now it is like this, can be an enormous way of befriending ourselves, but also by telling ourselves the truth, not adding those layers of reactivity that Ajahn Sucitto talked about in the passage that I read. So just the phrase, "It's like this." It really is like this right now. Okay, it is. I'm here. Another practice is to pause periodically to let ourselves touch into our awareness of the beauty or peace that's present and around us. And when I say this, I don't mean forcing ourselves to appreciate beauty. Okay, now I have to feel grateful. Oh, great. I have to ooh and ah over beauty. No, there is beauty, and just to open to see, not even to say we must connect with it, but to open to what may be there, to what we already feel or notice. And that can be not necessarily awe. Is there one glimmer? As you look out the window, is there some quality of light on a single leaf? The Taoist sage Chuang Tzu said, when you open your heart, you get life's 10,000 sorrows and 10,000 joys. And I thought I would share a story. I'm sharing this story with Mary Helen's permission. And little caveat, it does talk about reactions immediately after the 2016 election results. And just to normalize this, I'm telling a personal story about something that I care and cared about very deeply. It's not intended as a judgment or an exclusion of anyone who might not share my preferences about the particular election, but to talk about myself as a person in a particular situation. So Mary Helen and I were on retreat together with Spirit Rock's Advanced Practitioners Program, and the very first full day of our retreat was Election Day 2016. And as it happened, in that program, it was not entirely a silent retreat. There was room for mindful dialogue, and we were given the option to not know the results, to find out the results just by looking at a piece of paper the next day, or by going to the teacher's yurt and watching the election returns stream on TV. And many of us did that. By the end of the night, for some, and by the morning for others, we knew the results. And for many of us, that was very distressing, very painful, very frightening. And I had sat with Mary Helen while we were watching the returns. The next morning, we saw each other toward the end of breakfast, coming out of the dining hall. And Mary Helen, we looked at each other. Mary Helen put her arms around me and said, "It's still a beautiful world." I felt that so immensely. So the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows, to plug into the existence of the 10,000 joys while we're feeling the 10,000 sorrows, is a form of equanimity. And the experience of the ensuing week at that retreat speaks to the power of sitting practice. Many of us grieved and feared. We still sat with dignity. We didn't act out. We didn't react visibly in a way that would give it away to people who had chosen not to know during their retreat. And the fact of engaging with that presence and that dignity through our formal practice was very inspiring. I'm going to read a brief poem by Danusha Lamaris, who's a contemporary American poet, Thinking. Don't you wish they would stop? All the thoughts swirling around in your head, bees in a hive, dancers tapping their way across the stage. I should rake the leaves. I should rake the leaves in the carport, buy Christmas lights. Was there really life on Mars? What will I cook for dinner? I walk up the driveway, put out the garbage bins. I should stop using plastic bags, visit my friend whose husband just left her for the Swedish nanny. I wish I hadn't said Patrick's painting looked ominous. Maybe that's why he hasn't called. Does the car need oil again? There's a hole in the ozone the size of Texas, and everything seems to be speeding up. Come, let's stand by the window and look out at the light on the field. Let's watch how the clouds cover the sun and almost nothing stirs in the grass. So the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows. Okay, this is a really fun practice that a Dharma friend of mine shared. She said that she resolves in the morning she makes a resolution to take baby steps toward equanimity. And then she takes a series of tiny little steps. She embodies the idea of baby steps very literally to reinforce that in herself. Okay, slogans. So Tibetan Buddhist practice has a practice called lojong, which is a practice of training and reflecting with 59 slogans, which are their traditional slogans prescribed in their tradition. A couple of them are examine the nature of unborn awareness and don't expect applause. And we can adopt our own slogans as we either develop or find phrases that can help us do a reset or that can broaden our perspective or open possibilities. So I read a book by Pema Chodron, Start Where You Are, which spoke about lojong practice, which is not a practice I've adopted. I resonated with very few of the traditional phrases, although don't expect applause has some real staying power. But in talking about one of the other slogans, Pema Chodron said, I think that all of us are like eagles who have forgotten how to fly. I found that something that had real meat, and just those words as a reminder of what are we really? How do we orient ourselves? What are we really about? Had tremendous power, so that became one of my slogans. People who have worked in the 12-step tradition talk a lot about using slogans, and a friend of mine who is deeply engaged in that tradition of recovery shared with me slogans that refer to keeping your own side of the street clean and not taking someone else's inventory. And those really, as I see it, are equanimity phrases because they talk about boundaries. What can I affect? And what if I stress about it and tie myself in knots about it are not even mine to affect? I also love the phrase, we can always begin again and everything is workable. And I jotted that down in the last few days as I was working on this talk, and then I was unable to re-find whose phrase it is. It is a quotation, I just don't know from whom. And used as a slogan, Ajahn Sumedho's, it's like this. So whether we use them similarly to how Tibetan practice does as an ongoing, sustained source of study and reflection, or we condition ourselves simply to come back to these phrases in daily life when we notice reactivity, adopting a few that really speak to us. And they may change over time. There's no prescription that it has to be the same phrase every week or every year. So I want to just touch on several different daily life practices. And again, as with all of these are not necessarily talked about as equanimity practice, but they inherently cultivate equanimity because they're all practices of slowing down and paying attention. Basically, they are prompts to step away from our programmed reactions and perceptions. And doing this in any form, in any practice, has a tendency to widen our lens, to allow a little more oxygen around our experience. So just to note what they are briefly, parami practice, which we've talked about, the 10 qualities that we can work with in everyday life. And even though the pinnacle is equanimity, all of them, generosity, ethics, renunciation, wisdom, energy, patience, truthfulness, resolve, kindness, and equanimity, inherently point toward equanimity. Similarly, sila, or ethics practice, daily reflection on the 5 Buddhist ethical precepts and taking them on as a commitment, taking on the commitment to work with them, to use them as a reference point. to take our spiritual and ethical temperature. And when we talk about ethics practice within the Buddhist context, we're not just talking about being good. We're really training ourselves to reorient to the framework of non-harming and to the wisdom that supports non-harming behavior, which inherently is a more spacious frame of awareness. In a different vein, a reflection practice, what are sometimes called the 5 daily recollections or the 5 remembrances. And this is a way of holding a wisdom lens, again, pointing toward a larger understanding in front of us. It's recommended as a daily practice. And these are reflections that basically remind us that our bodies inherently are of a nature to age, to become sick or fail in one way or another, and to die. That anything we cherish or anyone we cherish will be separated from us and we from them, and that our actions and intentions plant seeds, have consequences that we inherit. And so it's a very rich practice, and you can find talks on the web about it, but just to name that as another practice that's very applicable to lay people with ordinary lives that point in the direction of the larger lens and equanimity. And finally, something that's often discussed in beginning meditation classes is taking mindful moments. Some people do that by setting a timer on their computer or more likely their phone. Just taking moments, however many times a day, to tune back into the breath or the body or into some question that you're practicing with. If you're working with the precepts, it might be tuning into a precept that you're trying to cultivate. But that idea of just mindful moments and how they accumulate and gain momentum. And finally, I would be negligent not to mention formal equanimity phrases. So traditionally, these can be worked with informal meditation, using phrases and applying them to a series of different beings or people. The traditional order is somewhat different than for metta phrases, loving kindness phrases, but it's a similar style of practice. And the traditional phrases include things like, all beings are the owner of their karma, their happiness and unhappiness depend on their actions, not on my wishes for them. And I want to acknowledge, just because we take on practices that support us as practitioners, I don't tend to be a practitioner of this sort of practice as a formal meditation. I don't personally resonate with the traditional phrase. For me, it has hooks of blame or of separation, and it has overtones of a cosmology that I don't necessarily embrace. I don't think that's necessarily inherent in that phrase. That's how it resonates on my mind, so I don't go there. But there are some wonderful, and you may find that a very rich phrase and well worth using. But there are alternative, more contemporary phrases, including some of the ones I'm going to mention are from Heather Sundberg, my teacher. Some are from elsewhere. All things arise and pass away and are not I or mine. May I trust the unfolding. May I hold these joys and sorrows with care, resilience, clear seeing, and balance. Things are what they are. And then, of course, Ajahn Sumedho's, it's like this. There we are again. That could be used in formal meditation. But understanding that while equanimity phrases can be used as formal meditation, like metta and traditionally have been, they can also be used as slogans. We can train ourselves again to bring them in, come back to them, say them to ourselves when we notice reactivity. So I'm going to end the talk part of the evening with a poem by a young contemporary poet, American poet, Deborah Kwan. And just one caveat, the poem uses the phrase white lies, which I think has some potential to be felt or understood in a manner that's racist. This is a contemporary poem by a very conscious non-white writer, and I considered and chose to read her full poem and with the phrase as she said it, but I also didn't want to be sloppy and not acknowledge that. So this is a very wonderful poem. The night after you lose your job. You know sleep will dart beyond your grasp, its edges crude and merciless. You will clutch at straws, wandering the cold, peopled rooms of the internet, desperate for any fix. A vapor of faith, an amply paid gig, perhaps for simply having an earnest heart, or keeping alive the children you successfully bore. Where, you'd like to know, on your resume, do you get to insert their names, or the diaper rash you lovingly cured with coconut oil, or the white lies you mustered about the older man in the cream-colored truck that glorious spring day, who hung his head out the window and shouted coronavirus while you were chalking unicorns and seahorses in the drive? Where do you get to say you clawed through their night terrors, held them through their sweaty grunting and writhing, half certain a demon had possessed them, and still appeared lucid for a 9 a.m. meeting, washed and combed and collared, speaking the language of offices? At last, what catches your eye is posted large font and purple. A local mother in search of baby clothes for another mother in need. Immediately, your body is charged, athletic with purpose, gathering diapers, clothes, sleep sacks, packing them tightly in bags. You tie the bags with a ribbon and set them on the porch for tomorrow. Then you stand at the door, chest thumping wildly, as if you have just won the lottery. And so you did, didn't you? You arrived here at this night in one piece from a lifetime of luck and error with something necessary to give. So what an expansion of perspective from my reversals to how does it fit in with the whole? It's the 10,000 joys and 10,000 sorrows, but also more. So we're going to go into some group discussion. We'll turn off the recording at this point. So my talk will be available, but